Hello, my name is Charles Upton. I've made this video to announce the publication of the second edition of my book, The Way Forward for Perennialism After the Antinomianism of Frithjof Schuon. So since this is the second edition, and some of you have written back to me puzzled saying, whatever happened to the first edition, I have to begin by quickly saying that the first edition had, in a few places, some references to certain practices of Frithjof Schuon, which in their time, 30 years ago, pretty much by now, were considered controversial. And I used them as a kind of a shortcut to an understanding of his ideas, saying, well, you see, he undoubtedly believed this because of X practice. And I and my publisher were contacted by members of Schuon's organization who impressed upon us their great displeasure at my making references to these things, which I had simply considered to be part of historical record, which they are. They're there, they're spoken of in other published works, which remain in print, but we were told in no uncertain terms we should really withdraw that book from publication. So very soon after it appeared, it disappeared again, poof. So that's the explanation, and I want to say that although that intervention was rather stressful at the time, I believe it was ultimately a very good thing, because it forced me to concentrate more deeply on Frithjof Schuon's ideas and also upon his paintings, which I had not mentioned in the first edition. And so I had to look, because that's what we've got. That's what we've got to work with. Schuon and whatever he may, his practice may have been, is no longer a factor. He's been gone since, I guess, 1999, quite a while ago. So, but what we have is his books and his paintings. And his books are, generally speaking, of such high quality and so unique in their achievement of his presentation of metaphysics and of comparative religion, that it would be a disaster if they were forgotten. And I fear, and I may be wrong here, maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, but I get a sense that, Frithjof Schuon may be in danger of being forgotten. On the other hand, there are younger people who are getting involved in perennialism who are going to be looking around for these books and saying, and having their minds blown by this amazing writing, as mine was so many years ago. And I think we deserve those who have spent a long time wrestling with these ideas and the various manifestations that arose from them. The younger people coming up now deserve our best shot at giving them some orientation in terms of what they're going to be, the world they're going to be coming into, as they begin to study perennialist ideas. So, too much of the commentary on Frithjof Schuon has had to do with old controversies, and I think that some of his defenders, who of course, if he is indeed their spiritual guide, their sheikh, they're required to take him as the touchstone of reality, as at least for them, in their particular initiatory relationship with him, and with his the organization that he founded, take him as the manifestation of God and the truth of God to them. And once you're in that relationship with a sheikh, you can't just go around criticizing him, saying, well, I like this, I don't like that. And And if you do that, the the efficacy of the whole reason for a relationship of a murid, of a follower with a murshid, a sheikh, is compromised. So I understand people who will defend Frithjof Schuon from any sort of criticism. Okay, I accept that is their position, and they're playing their role in the divine economy by doing that. That is not my position. My position is as someone who has been profoundly influenced by the ideas of Frithjof Schuon, probably more than any other single writer I've ever read, but all along had certain reservations about some of the tendencies I saw in his writings, some of the statements he made. By and large, though, I consider him to be one of the pinnacles of metaphysics, at least of the 20th century, if not longer. I mean, he's like I say, it would be disastrous if his writings were to disappear into the dustbin of history, or would be considered, if he were be considered to be something on the order of a fallen guru of the past. He's so much more than that. And sometimes I feel that the very understandable and very heartfelt defenses of Frithjof Schuon coming from his followers tend to, paint not the best picture of him. Because I think the fertility of his ideas is if he becomes the inheritance of all of those who are attracted to what he has written and, can begin to understand it. And this is a different world. This is a world of intellectual discourse. Intellectual discourse always has disagreements. The disagreements are not meant to, although sometimes those disagreements can get pretty hot, and there can be bad blood between people who disagree on theological and metaphysical issues. Certainly, that is proverbial, but that's not necessary. In the world of intellectual discourse at its best, you can say, I think this person has wonderful ideas in this regard. They're very helpful. They have helped me personally, but there's something I can't go along with. And then the person, if he were still alive, and there are certainly representatives of Frithjof Schuon who are still alive who can fulfill this role, they would say, well, I take your criticism, in good faith. You may have some good points here, but by and large, I can't agree with you on your central premise because of blah, 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 blah. In other words, we can act in a courteous manner as adults, not fearing that any criticism means you're condemning someone, which is certainly not the case of me and Frithjof Schuon, because I have the greatest gratitude to him for what he gave me. He and, his predecessors and followers, René Guénon in particular, his great predecessor, he and the other traditionalists or perennialists saved me from so much. They saved me from the 60s counterculture, one of the big influences that saved me from that. Saved me from the illusions and delusions of the New Age. Lifted me to a higher plane of understanding, and I don't know where I would be today without them. I owe them a debt that I cannot repay. So as we say nowadays, instead of trying to pay it back, you pay it forward. And one of the ways of paying it forward is to take the ideas of Frithjof Schuon as living realities and challenges to people's conception of things, but not as sacrosanct doctrine that can never be criticized, because if we take them in that manner, then they are not fertile for us. They do not engage our intelligence. They become objects of devotion, but we do not really wrestle with them as if we thought we could actually understand them. Because if you think you can understand something, you always retain the understanding that, and you might disagree with it. If you get to understand it, one of the effects is there could be some disagreements. And that is good. That's what keeps the intellectual life of the spiritual path alive and helpful to many, is if we can talk about these things. And we don't have to enshrine someone in a mausoleum of his own writings that we do not particularly expect to understand, but we will bow down before a pile of books instead of really, getting our hands dirty, getting in there, reading them, and figuring out if we really believe them or not, or to what degree we can accept them. So in other words, I have a different relationship to Frithjof Schuon than his followers. And I grant them their absolute right to be in that relationship to him. I hope they will now grant me what I consider to be my right to be in the same relationship, or my own unique relationship to Schuon, which is different from theirs. So, and it's funny to talk about Schuon. We'll get back to him a little later in this video, but I had to start with that. But let's get to perennialism itself. People are starting to talk about perennialism again. I get the idea the younger people are getting interested in it or discovering it. Now, it's a bit unfortunate, though, because perennialism is often dismissed as something along these lines. Oh, the perennialists believe that all the religions are equal and it doesn't matter which one you follow. Well, that's not actually the case. How can immensely unique, totally unique manifestations of the divine, of divine truth, absolutely unique, how can they be equal to each other? How can a lion be equal to an eagle? They're not equal. They're each a perfect manifestation of their archetype. And each of them are a manifestation ultimately of an attribute of God. Power, courage, scope, magnificence, beauty. But in totally different ways. You can't say they're equal. And it doesn't matter which one you choose. Well, first, I believe religions choose you more than you choose them. And anyone who is in the set of people who are destined to follow a traditional way, one of the traditional religions has got their name on it from all eternity. And that will be their way. They may think, well, I can see some good in this, maybe I should try that. Pretty soon, they'll find there's only one way for them. And so this idea, it doesn't matter which religion you choose, all the religions are equal, that doesn't hold water. That's not what perennialism is about. So anyway, the main doctrine, if there is one, of perennialism or traditionalist perennialism in the form that was given to it, or the form of expression that came from René Guénon and in particular Frithjof Schuon, is the transcendent unity of religions. And that's a difficult concept because the unity of religions is transcendent. It's not worldly. We can't make an amalgam of the religions in this world and say each one has a part of the truth, a piece of the pie. If we put them all together, we'll have the whole pie, a bigger pie than we've ever had. And that's not going to work. God never said that there should be one religion that would subsume all the other religions. There was no revelation to that effect. And Frithjof Schuon himself said, and rightly, he did not come to bring a new revelation. So that's not it. But exactly what it is, what does it mean that the unity of religions is transcendent, but it's not in the world of form? Well, my book tries to answer that. So anyway, perennialism, I'm going to say perennialism from now on instead of traditionalism, although I may go back to traditionalism when I need to, faces a very strange moment when everything, as I see it, that it was basically living on and living through in terms of the world has, within a very few years, completely reversed. Now, beginning, we could say, maybe sometime in the 19th century, and certainly, if you really want to be accurate about it, beginning probably in the Renaissance, but let's go back to the 19th century. The Western world developed a great spiritual cosmopolitanism. Partly this had to do with colonialism. Let's say Britain conquered a quarter of the world, including India, and people started to say, well, we've got a hold of this amazing thing. India is the jewel in the crown, but what is actually in India? What is India all about? Hinduism, these practices, these beliefs. That was one of the contributors to the spiritual cosmopolitanism of the West. The Freemasons were looking at many different religions. The Theosophical Society certainly were. I don't agree with their renditions of the different religions in many cases and of how they would relate, but in other words, they were part of this whole move of spiritual cosmopolitanism. And there were writers like Sir James Frazer of the Golden Bough and Robert Graves, who wrote The White Goddess, and their successor, Joseph Campbell, who's talking about world mythologies, which are simply the remnants of many religions. All of this was coming together. There were these great German, students of religion who would come up with meta theories of what religion is, and so much of this was coming together, and it looked like we were going to get to a place where we would inherit the spiritual riches of the entire world. All the religions, all the scriptures were being translated, had been translated. The great sages from the different traditions, from Islam, from Buddhism, from Hinduism, were all appearing in English translation and in other Western languages. And what a rich time it was. I'm putting this in the past. What a rich time it was. And the great poets, from India and from the Islamic world. All of this, was a great treasure that we collected from the four corners of the earth and from thousands of years of time. And here it all was. And wasn't something wonderful going to come out of this union of all of these wisdoms, these exquisite teachings from so many different places and times? Well, we got to that point, and then what? Well, we got all this religions here, and the next step was not clear. And the religions did not immediately amalgamate into a vast meta-religion that was better than all of them put together, which I believe is a vain hope. So what happened? Suddenly, we're looking at, the liberation from Western colonialism of many of the nations and culture areas from which these religions came. And the people living there didn't particularly want to be part of the grand synthesis that the colonialists were putting together of all the religions. They say, I'm sorry, we're Hindus and we're not Muslims. I'm sorry, we're Muslims, we're not Christians. I'm sorry, we are ourselves. We're not what you say we are, and we're not just pieces in your great puzzle, because your puzzle is from their point of view, simply a colonialist hegemony, in the intellectual sphere, and we want no part of it. And now we're living in a world where all of the different religions and cultures that the West thought it could in some way encompass are now all rebelling and saying, no, we don't want to be a part of your spiritual cosmopolitanism. We are ourselves, and that's who we want to be. So this is not something that was expected. I mean, I came out of the counterculture of the 60s, and boy, that was one of the flowerings of all of this material. It was a very rich time, a very chaotic time, very destructive time in a lot of ways. But if you wanted to learn a lot fast, there was nothing like being immersed in that time and that movement. And my wife and I were friends with, for example, Professor Houston Smith. He was one of the paragons, and one of the people who was standing at the top of this wonderful pile of treasure, of all the different religions. Frithjof Schuon was another one who made in many ways a synthesis, or was able to speak in the language of many of the different religions. And it all, it looked like we'd finally gotten somewhere. But like I say, there was nowhere to go from there, because a unity of many religions, while on the intellectual level, is a wonderful treasure and teaches so much, it really can't be a spiritual path. God didn't send this big meta-religion that we're all supposed to be part of now in the globalist and new world order. God sent specific revelations to specific peoples at different times. And now many of them are still alive and available, although all the revelations are damaged by the darkness of the world, as we all can see so clearly nowadays. The state of the world, rather sad, and the religions are suffering under this darkness that's come over the human race. We can't imagine that they, in many cases, exist in their pristine purity as people like Frithjof Schuon and Houston Smith portrayed them. In a certain sense, they do. The essence of all the religions is still there, but they're covered over by many veils of conflict and misunderstanding and degeneracy. Attacks from without by secular forces and degeneracy from within. So it's a lot messier and a lot more dangerous time than somebody like Houston Smith ever knew. He passed away a few years ago at the age of 96, and it's almost like he took that time with him. He was, the sunny, generous, optimistic inheritor of all of this. And he didn't quite live to see, or to see with his, the fullness of his faculties, the terrible things that were about to happen that would all but destroy this beautiful synthesis we've been putting together for several centuries. So, yet here we have perennialism still, because once you know that other religions than the religion you were born in can produce saints, and you know what a saint is, you will never say, well, or easily say, well, my religion is the, Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy is the true church. Islam is the one true religion. You won't be able to say that. Unfortunately, you already know too much. For good or ill, you already know more than that. So what's necessary mysteriously, though, you know that, and yet the great synthesis of all the religions is not going to be a viable spiritual way for anybody. It's only going to be a way that the global elites, you know, a way for them to control vast populations. That's what it turns into. It all becomes cynical geopolitics in the end if you don't watch out. So after knowing that more than one religion is valid and sent by God, how do you practice one religion sincerely and thoroughly? It's not easy. It's not easy. But it's what must be done. And the other thing is the fact that there are more religions than one who are now in each other's face, confronting each other in every conceivable way, no longer sealed in their own, you know, cultural, spiritual civilizations. And so each could appear to be the entire universe. And universes have collided, and we're going to have to deal with that, messy as it is, in some way. And that's why perennialism is still relevant. Not because it represents the great cosmopolitan union of all the religions which will save the earth. No, because it can help us deal with the contradictions and the calamities and the mysterious affinities and the mysterious lessons being learned when the religions are, you know, clash with one another, as they must in a world like this. So perennialism still got a place. So I'm going to go through my book. My book is two parts. The first one is just on the way forward for perennialism, and the second has to do with my evaluation, both positive and negative, of Frithjof Schuon as a perfect example of the best perennialism was able to achieve and some of the worst contradictions it now faces. That's what part two is. Of part one, I'm just going to go over the chapter titles. Some of these I'll explain, some I won't. Chapter one, the multiplicity and unity of religions according to Guénonian traditionalism, an alternative way of doing comparative religion. Well, you know, read that. If your field is comparative religion, you'll find perhaps a new paradigm for conceiving of what the multiplicity of religions means and how they can relate to each other. We hope. Chapter 2, entering houses by their doors, the uniqueness and commonality of Christianity and Islam. Well, here's where we get tread on dangerous territory, showing how Christianity and Islam are more similar than many people, even, you know, interfaith practitioners of goodwill, you know, have ever suspected, and yet showing how there's an irreducible difference between them. Otherwise, there would not be two religions. They have to contradict each other. It's necessary at a particular point. And after they contradict each other, then you got to go home to your own faith and give it your all, and not get so excited about looking at parallels and similarities, which are important to see on one level. But you know, like I like to say, they say that perennialism teaches all paths lead up the mountain to the same peak. All the religions lead up the mountain to the same peak. And what I say is, you cannot walk on two paths at the same time. And a lot of people try to walk on 2 or 3 or 4 paths at the same time, and they do not get very far. So the next one is Sufism and Jnana Yoga, some correspondences. This was fun. I was looking at the Sufism of my own tariqa, which is the Alawiya, a lesser known branch of the Alawiya, and looking at things such as what is called Ma'rifah of the Nafs, which is gnosis of the self. You know, the nafs both in the negative sense of the ego and the positive sense of your unique individuality. And what's the relationship between that and the jnana yoga of Ramana Maharshi? And I said, well, there's many correspondences. In a certain way, they're saying the same thing. And this became an article that was published by the Ramana Maharshi's ashram, the Ramanashrama, I guess it's called, in Tiruvannamalai in India. It was published in their journal, The Mountain Path. I was very happy to get published in that journal. So that's an example of what Frithjof Schuon called esoteric ecumenism. And I think this one works. So a lot of them don't work. You throw things together and they don't really cohere. You have to admit the differences are greater than the similarities. But here, there's some real unanimity. So, next one is the Trinitarian problem in Christian-Muslim dialogue. Oh yes, strict monotheism is the only way for Muslims. Christians need to be Trinitarians, and yet they too are monotheists. And what does this mean? What I find, there are more similarities between the Christian and the Muslim view than anybody suspected, yet there's still irreducible differences that must be respected. Must be. So, next one, chapter 5, the questions of God's incarnation as Jesus Christ in Christian-Muslim dialogue. If anything, that's a more difficult question. But I take a similar approach to that. You can see how, from a Sufic standpoint, you can see what the Christians are talking about. Standing here as a Muslim, I see what they're talking about. Then you have to say, but they literalized it a bit too much, perhaps. Well, read it and see what you think. This is another one, just called From a Letter to a Christian Mystic. I'll let you read that on your own. This chapter, that was chapter 6. Chapter 7, The Nature of Ontological Perspectives, a commentary on Frithjof Schuon's doctrine of the relatively absolute. Wow, he was trying to deal. How can each religion be a rendition of the absolute, and yet there be more than one religion? So he comes up, he says, each religion must incarnate an element of absoluteness. Well, once you say an element of absoluteness, you're already in trouble. But what are you going to do? He had to say that. That there's, this is the mystery of why there are more than one religion, and how that is possible. Where religions that must contradict each other in a certain level, how can they all be true? Well, like I say, you can do anything on paper or on the computer screen, and there's a way of saying it, and I'm taking off from Frithjof Schuon's way of saying it and developing that. So this is for the intellectual dark, chapter 8, for the intellectual dark web, a letter to Rebel Wisdom. Rebel Wisdom is a group that folded a few years ago. They were at one point kind of a platform for, or wished to become the platform for Jordan Peterson and other people who have gone on to be some of the most interesting spiritually based psychologists and social critics in our society today, in the great university known as YouTube, which there's more erudition on YouTube, I'm telling you, than in any Harvard University. That's my opinion. So I'm saying this is also on some contemporary intellectual and social movements based on or compatible with traditional metaphysics. So see if that works. Chapter 9, now this is a story. This is called The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad as a Valid Exoteric Expression of the Transcendent Unity of Religions, a Call for United Front Ecumenism. Well, this was a peace movement that I was involved in. I was actually number 2 guy in this peace movement. from 2013 to about 2020, essentially COVID was the barrier, was the end point. But it had also run its course anyway. Dr. John Andrew Morrow, an amazing scholar of Islam, he's a Métis, which is a French word meaning someone of mixed Native American and European blood, from Quebec. The Métis in Canadian law have their own special position, legal position. And a most amazing scholar of Islam. He discovered the covenants that the Prophet Muhammad granted to Christian groups and also some Jewish groups and Zoroastrian and other groups of his time. And these are amazing documents which throw the entire socio-political ministry of the Prophet Muhammad into a new light, which solves so many problems about, for example, what verses of the Quran having to do with how Islam is to relate to the other religions, which are some of these all abrogated, or in other words, where the Quran is obscure because we don't quite know its intent, you can see the actual practice or sunnah of the Prophet in the way he diplomatically dealt with the other religions. And then you can go back to the Quran and Hadith and say, oh, I see what it means now. Those are fascinating documents. And what was so interesting, Dr. Morrow had discovered them and continued to discover more of them, largely in many of them in ancient monasteries in the Near East. And he was bringing them to light just as ISIS was rearing its ugly head, as it appears to be doing again now. And if there were ever documents that explicitly say any Muslims who do what ISIS does have earned the curse of Muhammad and the curse of Allah. And so they were incredibly relevant for a short period of time, and still are. I mean, it's more or less out of our hands now, but other people have adopted these documents and are putting them to use in very many interesting ways. And this is something that people don't know about, should inform themselves of, and follow and become part of. So that's a story. And the reason that that's in this book is because I never would have understood the Prophet Muhammad's way of relating to the other religions. What he essentially wanted to do in, let's say, the Constitution of Medina is form a federation of the peoples of the book against the large and oppressive empires of the time, Persia and Byzantium. And it worked for a short time, then it fell apart, but it was his real wish. And it's as if some of that wish is still active. And but I wouldn't have understood that if I hadn't first understood what the transcendent unity of religions was all about. So this is an expression, in a certain sense, of the transcendent unity of religions. Okay, you may or may not agree. Chapter 10 is toward a brotherhood of silence, a response to fraternity for knowledge and cooperation, which is a document authored by Sheikh Yahya Pallavicini of, I forget the name of his organization, but the acronym spells out Correis. He's one of the major civic sheikhs of Italy. He's a follower of René Guénon. And it's his response to Pope Francis's rapprochement with the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar in the major university of the Sunni Muslim world. and the ambiguities of this. And so he wrote a response to a document that came out of the Pope's meeting with the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar, and then I wrote a paper in response to his paper. And essentially what you have here, I mean, Pope Francis brought the Catholic Church closer in diplomatic terms to Islam than ever at any time in human history. Unfortunately, in his deconstruction of fundamental Catholic doctrine, he unwittingly, or maybe deliberately for all I know, separated his church far more radically from Islam than has ever been separated at any time in human history. And that's a very ironic thing. And you can see the contradictions of the attempts to come to religious understanding and religious cooperation in a world so violently polarized as today. So that's all, a take on all of that. Okay. All right, that's chapter 1, or part 1. Part 2 is the Antinomianism of Frithjof Schuon. Well, what's Antinomianism? Well, the Antinomians are those who believe that they don't have to follow the religious law of their particular tradition because, for a number of reasons, if they've reached a certain degree of esoteric or mystical understanding, they are loosed, as St. Paul said, we're no longer under the curse of the law. That after he said that, he said, on the other hand, these are the rules and you got to obey them, but you're no longer under the curse of the law. Well, Antinomians say, we have transcended the law, it does not apply to us. Or some will say, well, we're in a new phase now, and like the Ismailis in Islam, and the Sharia has been abrogated, and Allah is doing a new thing that transcends the law. So there are a lot of ambiguities here, because certainly God transcends all the laws that he's laid down for us, and he's bound by none of them. And yet, we're bound by them. Is there a way that we too can transcend them? This is the whole question that Schuon was wrestling with, sometimes in a rather difficult way for the people who are following his words and his actions. But that's the way the world is nowadays. Sometimes when the law, the nomos, becomes petrified and does not allow the breath of the Spirit into the rules of life, Antinomianism, usually a very short duration, seems, from a certain perspective, to have a real spiritual function. As with Al-Hallaj, the Sufi who exclaimed in an ecstatic state, "Ana al-Haq," I am the truth, which is tantamount to saying I am God. For that he was executed for blasphemy, which is the rights of the exoteric world. And yet, in the esoteric dimension, was there some truth to that? Or was Hallaj wiped out at that moment in what the Sufis called fana, or annihilation? And it was Allah himself speaking, who had a total right to say that, of course. So that question, Antinomianism of Frithjof Schuon, which has really been a difficulty for a lot of people who have followed him. Well, these are difficult times. It's understandable that such a difficulty should be presented to us. I don't want to minimize the difficulty, but I do not want to simply say, well, the Antinomians, you know about them, they all go to hell. We don't know where people go. I mean, God has more resources and more tricks up his sleeve than any of us can imagine. And Frithjof Schuon was certainly an example of that very principle. So this goes on. Chapter 11, the pivotal importance of Frithjof Schuon. So I'm saying these are the what? How many? 11? These are the 11 great things that he did. Number one, his restatement of the hierarchy of being, the ontological hierarchy, the great chain of being, doing it in a number of amazing and very, very telling ways, very profound ways. Two, his definition of the supreme principle, the absolute, the Godhead of Meister Eckhart, the Nirguna Brahman of the Vedantists, etc., the Al-That of the Sufi Muslims, divine essence, his definition of the supreme principle in terms of the absolute, the infinite, and the perfect. And it was an amazing way to approach the supreme principle from those three different directions. And he has incredible things to say about how they are and how they interact. So, 3, his re-enunciation of the epistemological principle of the intrinsic union of the knower with the known. There is something in us, since we are formed on the truth, we can know the truth. The nous, or the eye of the heart within us, is both that which sees the truth and that which partakes of the truth and is the truth. As Meister Eckhart said, the eye through which I see God and the eye through which he sees me, they are the same eye. So he did amazing things on that theme. So then we say his introduction of the poetic and aesthetic element that was missing in his great predecessor René Guénon, from which he got many of his principles, we have to say. He was a developer of Guénon more than any other single thing. Number 5, his corrections of Guénon's view of Christianity. Guénon believed that Christianity had lost its esoteric dimension. And so he was always looking to see if he could create some kind of Masonic order on a more or less on the model of a Sufi order within Islam that could rejuvenate the Western Christianity. He finally gave up on that because it is a thankless task and it can't really be done. And Schuon was smarter, and he came in and he said, look, Christianity has not lost its esoteric dimensions. The esoteric dimension of Christianity is the sacraments. Sacraments are initiatory rites, and that's exactly what Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite, also said. So he got that right, and he corrected Guénon on that point. So 6, his establishment following Guénon but surpassing him of the axial nature of terrestrial humanity and the centrality of the human form. Such an important thing for us to remember now, since we're in the process of forgetting what it is to be human beings, and and we've invented artificial intelligence in order to make sure we totally forget and will never remember again, unless we listen to people like Frithjof Schuon, who will remind us. We need to be reminded of that, and he did a great job in doing so. Okay, his clear distinction, also following and clarifying Guénon between the psychic and the spiritual domains. Yeah, the whole New Age problem is mistaking the psychic for the spiritual. So many problems come from that, and he did a wonderful job in making and reinforcing that distinction. Although certainly he got 99% of that from Guénon, but that needed to be. You can't say that too many times. Number 8, his universal eschatology, elucidating the many destinies of the human soul after death. He's got a wonderful thing of that in his book, Survey of Metaphysics and Esotericism. We hear all these things, heaven, hell, purgatory, the many paradises and many hells of the Hindus and the Buddhists, The idea of reincarnation, of being lost in the whirlpool of existence, and all of these things. Is there any commonality between these things? And he takes a pretty good stab at showing how they're all looking at the mystery of the destiny of the soul after death from different perspectives. It's a very, very good section. So his emanationist, number 9, his emanationist theodicy. Well, he does about the best answer to the question, how could an all good and all powerful God create a world in which there is evil? The spiritual liberals say, well, he was all good because he's well-meaning, but just like a liberal, he doesn't have the power to really fix anything, but he means well. That's the liberal idea, whereas the conservative idea is, he's got the power, he can do whatever he wants, and, what's this goodness, If you don't watch out, that's the way the conservative direction will go. So says basically, it's like God is as if he were the sun, and the light of the sun shines out into space and gets dimmer and dimmer the farther away from the sun you are. And this is like as the ontological hierarchy of worlds is descended from the divine to the celestial to the psychic to the corporeal, down and down, there are more and more veils to the light of God, and the light of God is more distant, and you get to a point where evil becomes possible. And there has to be evil, because if there were no evil in the universe, there would be no universe. The universe would be God, because God is the sovereign good. And if the universe too were the sovereign good, there would be no universe. There would only be God. So if there's going to be creation, there have to be gaps and lacks and holes and imperfections in creation that allow the many forms of all things to exist. Now that's a pretty profound thing. I mean, that satisfied me as to, how can God, create a universe filled with evil? I was satisfied. Except I always add at this point, there is a point where you're descending the hierarchy and where, alternatives become possible. You could choose truth or falsehood. You can choose good or evil. You have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and choice develops. And now you have free will, and now you have to choose. And now some beings will choose the one, some beings will choose the other. And here you have the whole Judeo-Christian idea of the fall of the angel, more Christian than Jewish, the fall of the angels, and and evil not just as an attenuation and a weakening of the divine light as it shines farther away from its source, but as based upon the misuse of free will. You got to make that a subset of the larger theodicy, or you're going to run into problems. So all of the idea that evil came from from transgression, from sin, from rebellion against God, that's all part of it on a certain level. That has to be there. So I always say, don't forget that part, or you have a serious flaw in the presentation of the reason for evil. So, number 10, okay, his defense of the traditional faiths in the face of the imposed religious pluralism of the modern world, by his clear articulation based on his doctrine of the relative absolute, of the transcendent unity of religions, making clear that this transcendent unity is neither a syncretistic amalgam of the faiths nor any new revelation that supersedes them. Now, he, as with many people, he struggled with that. He might, that was his principle, but then you could see him not quite able to live with that in every respect, because it is a very hard thing to live with. But since the world is hard now, and we're not going to expect it to get any less hard, we can live with that too. If we can deal with all the other crap that's going on, we can stand that one, I trust. So, and I say 11, above all, his defense of transcendental objectivity against every form of subjectivism and psychologism. Yeah, he did a great job. It's like my mentor as a poet was Beat Generation poet Lou Welch, and he always had this line. He said, I seek union with what goes on, whether I look at it or not. In other words, something's really there, whether or not, like the Beatles say, life goes on within you and without you. There is an objective reality. And yet, this reality is only alive to you as an experience, as a part of your life and your spiritual life, if you engage with it and make something out of it. And by your attention, awaken it from its virtuality and make it actual. Both of those things are operating. So then chapter 12, how to read Schuon, the importance of a second look. Chapter 13, metaphysical errors in the writings of Frithjof Schuon, their role in discernment. There's this well-known to those who know it, saying in the guru world is, the errors of a master are more enlightening than the best considered wisdom of an ordinary man or woman. I believe that, but exactly how can someone's errors be enlightening? If they're errors, wouldn't they be the worst? And the closer they are to the truth, the more toxic they are as errors. But there's a way, as William Blake said, to be in error and to be cast out as part of God's plan. Error has to constellate and appear as a real untruth, and you see why that untruth is there and what agenda an untruth like that serves, and what part of your own concupiscence and passions, are enamored of that kind of error. And so all of this dark or shadow side of the great teachings of a great teacher also have a profoundly enlightening effect if you can stand them. If you can stand to face that they're there, it's very formidable to find someone whose knowledge of things divine so far surpassed yours that you could hardly encompass him, and then who trains you to see with the kind of eye that he saw with, and that you could never have done without him, and then understand, wait, there's some serious errors here, But I think that's what we got to do, not just with Frithjof Schuon, but with everything. We can't idealize anything in this world. This world is a world of polarities and contradictions in essence. And the sooner we admit that and get used to it and learn to deal with the whole thing, light and dark, and all of the contradictions, in the faith and in the knowledge, in the certainty that there is something beyond those all that encompasses them all, and that is the perfection of all of them, even if we can't exactly see that now. Well, the sooner we learn to do that, the better off we'll be in a world this crazy, because we're not going to find a perfect monastery somewhere in a mountain valley where all is peace. Not in this world. Never in this world. So, Frithjof Schuon can teach us how to ride the tiger, to use Julius Evola's phrase, how to ride the tiger in exactly that way, if you can face his errors. So then a letter to Wolfgang Smith on orthodoxy, exoterism, esoterism, cosmology, and Frithjof Schuon. You can read that to find out what it's about. That was chapter 14, chapter 15. Was Frithjof Schuon really a traditionalist? A review of Keys to the Beyond, Frithjof Schuon's Cross-Traditional Language of Transcendence by Patrick Laud, published by SUNY Press 2021. In a way, that's the most interesting representation of Schuon's ideas by one of his followers. Patrick Laud found some things in Schuon that he didn't quite seize upon as, you mean he said that? You know, but that's what he allowed me to see, you know. And he has some wonderful chapters that you know, express Schuon's doctrines and even go a bit beyond them in certain directions that are just wonderful essays. But he starts out by saying the doctrines of Frithjof Schuon need to be reinterpreted, re-envisioned in order to appeal to global intellectuals. And when I heard that, I sort of saw red because, you know, earlier in Frithjof Schuon's career, and you know, during most of the time when he was alive, his whole idea was we are against the modern world. The modern world has no, you know, is the enemy of spirituality in every respect. That was one of the keynotes of traditionalism. And then Patrick Laud seems to turn 180 degrees and say, well, actually, no. We can make it part of the world, you know. So this is why I call his book something that manifests something in the order of a Second Vatican Council for traditionalism. Those of you who follow the struggles of the Catholic Church now will know how many traditional Catholics will say the Second Vatican Council began the destruction, to use Rama Kumaraswamy's phrase, title of his major book, the destruction of the Christian tradition. So this represents a big about face for the traditionalists, which I want to point out. So, and then the last word, it says, Schuon is a manifestation of Maya. That's the addendum. The earlier was chapter 15, then comes the addendum, which is a short thing saying, well, Maya. You know, Schuon was very close to the divine feminine, and when you're close to the divine feminine, you are in the dimension of Maya. And Maya dramatizes everything, dramatizes every truth, every error, everything conceivable. Maya makes part of her dance. And Maya has two elements, Vidya Maya and Avidya Maya. Avidya Maya is just ignorance. You know, multiplicity has veiled the face of unity. There are all these different competing and contradictory ideas which, you know, create so much confusion that you can no longer see the truth, and you're led in very dangerous directions, and the passions are inflamed, and all of this. That's one effect of Maya. The other effect of Maya is Vidya Maya, which is, and in the midst of all this, what it all really is the eternal truths of God are being dramatized in innumerable different situations and renditions and dimensions. And it's the vast dramatization of truth, you know. All the world's a stage for the truths of God. And the funny thing about Maya, she doesn't come divided neatly into those two packages. She's the whole thing. And it depends upon your attitude toward Maya, whether she'll be Avidya Maya or Vidya Maya to you. So Maya is the great challenge to the spiritual life. And we can't simply make sense of her in an intellectual way. She's always beyond 1 or 10 steps beyond our smartest, you know, way of construing what we think she is. And Schuon manifested that in just quintessentially. And that means he's, like they say about the spiritual teacher about spiritual master, if you don't have room in your house for an elephant, don't make friends with an elephant trainer. And Schuon was an elephant trainer without doubt. Or was he a rogue elephant? Well, that's the question. One or the other, both. Well, that's Maya for you. So that's how that book goes. So I was going to say something else. Am I? Yeah. Well, I feel ultimately Schuon was given an amazing, unique, and very profound, very timely doctrine to transmit to the world. But it's on its way from wherever it began till it came through him and came out in his manifestation, in his books and paintings and stuff, and his actions. Somewhere it was damaged because we live in a world of profound spiritual darkness, and the difficulty of telling spiritual truth in a world this dark and this filled with delusion, this filled with fear and violence and numbness and despair. The difficulty is formidable. So when we look at his doctrines and see the truth and yet see the places where the truth seems to have been damaged or distorted here and there, what we're seeing is what we're all up against now. That's, studying Frithjof Schuon, we can see this is the fate of the expression of truth in a world like this. Can we learn to avoid some of these pitfalls, or can we see that? Well, that's the end now. So I'm supposed to pray at this point. So since it is time for me to pray, I'm going to turn this off and go and do my prayer as the adhan, as the electronic muezzin calls. And that shows that this video is at an end. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope this hasn't just been a spoiler where I've given away the whole thing and now you don't have to buy the book. Nah, you better buy the book. There's a lot more in the book than what I was able to put in this video. Oh, thank you. Goodbye.